Welcome to FO Live. With me are two stalwarts. Professor Ishtiaq Ahmed in Stockholm is probably the leading scholar on Pakistan. His three books, The Garrison State, The Punjab Bloodied and Partitioned, and A Biography of Jinnah are the defining works of scholarship on Pakistan. Known to be intellectually fair, credible, and extremely rigorous, he is the best authority we can have on Pakistan. Thomas Barfield is the author of A History of Afghanistan, Princeton University Press. Thomas Barfield has also written Shadow Empires. I should say Professor Thomas Barfield. He's a professor as well. Professor Thomas Barfield is also known for his wit, storytelling, and extraordinary wisdom. So we have two stalwarts here. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So, without further ado, paint us a picture, and Ishtiaq, you go first, and then Thomas, you can add to Ishtiaq's picture as to why do we suddenly have these tensions between an Afghanistan led by the Taliban, which was obviously supported by the inter-services intelligence, and a Pakistan which is now run practically by the military, de facto, if not de jure. So what is going on, Ishtiaq?
Well, almost on a daily basis things change. But from what I know of the latest, you see, this has been festering for a long, long time. After the Americans left, there was this hope in Pakistan that we will again convince the Afghan government to become part of our strategic depth, and that we will once again in this part of the world emerge as a power to be reckoned with. But you see, in the years just before that, there was a checkered sort of history between Afghanistan and Pakistan. There was the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and the Taliban who were in government in Afghanistan. And the Tehreek people turned against Pakistan once Pakistan joined the war on terror after President Bush had almost threatened Pakistan, either you are with us or against us. And that resulted in several years of terrorism in Pakistan. And then, of course, that subsided, things never went back to normal, but the Taliban consolidated their power and they started then having good relations with Pakistan's arch enemy number one, India. So this India-Afghanistan connection, one of the ministers came to India and went to Deoband, the main seminary of puritanical Sunni Islam. So while India and the Taliban are cozy now, previously it was the Northern Alliance and India which were close, whereas the Taliban regime was pro-Pakistan. Now things have changed in the other direction. And Pakistan has ordered, I think, more than 2 million, maybe more Afghans to leave Pakistan. And they are being, hunted down and sent back, and that has created a lot of bad blood.
Yeah.
Bad blood. With the result that the Afghans have been attacking Pakistani police stations and ambushed the army. And so another round of this violence from both sides is going on. I think this is the background. Going back into the past, I think Thomas and you and I know already how it all started. Afghanistan was the only government which opposed Pakistan's membership in the United Nations. Although that changed soon afterwards, but we never
back to 1947, of course. Now
that's correct. That's correct. 1947, and you see, let me put it the way I understand. The Northwest Frontier Pakhtuns were in favor of a united India along with the Congress party.
You're talking of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan.
Khan
also
Abdul
known as
Ghaffar Khan, the
Frontier
Khudai
Party.
Khudgar,
Yeah.
they had an elected government in the Northwest Frontier province of Pakistan. But prior to that, just when they realized that there might be an India and Pakistan, the Afghans then, the Pakhtuns, Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan and his brother and others, they wanted the third option, Pakhtunistan, that they be given the choice to remain independent or maybe join with Afghanistan. This was a very last moment sort of realization when they were given no chance to, first of all, they didn't want India to be partitioned. The British decided finally that they will partition India. Now, they didn't want to be part of Pakistan. They wanted another option, that of Pakhtunistan. It was a very late arrival, sometimes the 22nd of June, 1947. A referendum was held, which they boycotted, and the referendum was in favor of Pakistan by a very narrow sort of 50% of the people who had the right to vote voted, and Pakistan won that referendum. After Pakistan came into being, the elected government in the Northwest Frontier was thrown out of office by Governor General Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and the leadership was arrested, and then started a round of confrontations and so on, until in the 1970s, after Pakistan broke up, the NAP government in the Northwest Frontier, headed by Wali Khan, son of Khan Abdul Ghaffar Khan, he made a move to join mainstream Pakistani politics by declaring Urdu as the main language of Northwest Frontier and not Pashto. But somehow Bhutto didn't want any opposition party to be in power. He was already ruling in the center, in the main province of what was left of Pakistan, Punjab and Sindh. So he didn't, he was the feudal type of person, wouldn't have an
You're
opposition.
talking of Zulfikar Ali Bhutto.
Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, yes.
Zulfikar,
yes.
Zulfikar Ali Bhutto.
So the government in Balochistan and Northwest Frontier were thrown out on charges of being against Pakistan, and they were tried at the Hyderabad conspiracy case and so on. So afterwards, I think, when the Taliban came into power and Pakistan was the only country apart from Saudi Arabia and the UAE which recognized them, still, despite all the effort of the Pakistan government, they failed to convince the Taliban, who were their not exactly protege, but dependent on their support, to accept the Durand line laid down by the British in, I think, 1893 or something, as the international border. They said nothing doing. Our Afghan regime extended all the way to the Attock, which is, way into what is almost on the borders of Punjab. And so that's where the background of the whole issue is.
Thomas, please
Yes,
add to it.
what we see is essentially a long-term structural problem that's always been there in the formation of Pakistan. So the Afghans got into this by claiming that all the treaties with the British were null and void because they were leaving, and Pakistan, we're the successor state, they're valid. So that left the whole question of where borders were, recognition, and also the Durand line. The British had never made it an international border. It was a line of demarcation because they didn't rule the Northwest Frontier province directly, the tribal areas. So as the British put it, they saw it as zone of influence, that we rule directly at places like Peshawar, rule indirectly the tribal areas of the Northwest frontier, and the Afghans are in charge of the other side. But the people who lived on that border went back and forth. To them, it wasn't a border. That was, they lived on both sides.
So they intermarried, life carried on as usual.
And they weren't two different people.
Hmm.
So when all the refugees began coming out during the Soviet period, one of the reasons they were welcomed is that people said, they're our people. They're not strangers coming in. They're our brothers coming in, right? So, So what we have is sort of the nation state idea of fixed boundaries and specific groups coming together with the old order of South and Central Asia, is that there's zones of influence that governors rule over, that they may have sovereignty, but they don't have control over. And as some of the Afghans said, why should we recognize a border with Pakistan on a territory that Pakistan actually doesn't control directly? I mean, they were going back and forth, but Pakistan was more powerful. It controlled the only sea access to Afghanistan. Afghanistan is landlocked. So when the Pashtunistan issue began to rise, Pakistan cut off all trade. Pakistan, and that brought down the Dawood government in 1963, in part because the Afghan government was not prepared to do that, but also because the monarchy itself was of two minds about how far to push this. If we look at it further, what we begin to see is that Kabul and Delhi have always had better relations than Kabul with Islamabad, no matter what government has been in charge. And the belief in Pakistan is if we can get that pro-Delhi government out, whether it's the communists, or the Republic, and put our people in, then we'll have our strategic depth. The difficulty is that Afghan insurgents were essentially loyal to Pakistan's program only as long as they were in Pakistan. As soon as the insurgency was over and they were back in Afghanistan, no government, not Mullah Omar, not the current Taliban, not the Republic, ever recognized the Durand line. And that was a bottom line policy for Pakistan. And the irony was that the clients that they had cultivated, sometimes over decades, were the first to turn against them once they became, essentially, they became Afghans once they returned back to Afghanistan. And this time for the Taliban, you could have predicted this if they weren't able to get Mullah Omar to recognize this. How were they going to get these new Taliban? What was the difference? And so what we have is when the Taliban take over in Afghanistan, they go back to the old, and that goes all the way back to the monarchy. Same policy when it comes to sort of Pakistan. But also, if you're going to oppose Pakistan, then obviously one of the places to look is support from Delhi. And, that has nothing to do in some ways with agreeing with India's larger policies, but that's a game that Afghans were familiar with. They also, with India's help, opened up a road system so that they could now be supplied by sea from Balochistan port of Charbahar. So for the first time, goods could come into Afghanistan, and India could come into Afghanistan via Iran. So we began to see sort of different possibilities that weren't there before. The Soviet Union also collapsed, and so instead of a monolith to the north, now we have these Central Asian republics. So it's a very kind of different situation. But the interesting thing is, regardless of the ideology of the Afghan governments, the one thing they had in common is their opposition to Pakistan, thinking of them as a fifth province. And during Mullah Omar's reign, when it went back in 2002, things people most objected to, and they said Pakistan called us a fifth province. We are not the fifth province of Pakistan. And in some ways, their feeling was when the Americans took Afghanistan, if you had asked the Northern Alliance, they said, why don't we march on Peshawar and take that back? That's our city. The animosity there within Afghanistan is extremely strong. And by sending 2 million Afghans back from Pakistan, many of whom were born there, they've grown up there, you exacerbate this, because the people most willing probably to see an integration with Pakistan and Afghanistan, because they're living in Pakistan, are now sent back to say, go it alone in Afghanistan. You've created, if you will, sort of an Afghan-Pakistani diaspora that has no love lost for a Pakistan government that might have acted as an intermediary, but that's sort of gone. So now you're back to sort of a bipolar frontier sort of situation.
So thank you both for painting a very good picture of the history, the background, the context. And at Fair Observer, we prize context. Now that we know a little bit of the history, what follows next? Does this conflict remain low level, or do we see border skirmishes turn into a war? Do we see the Northwest Frontier Province want succession from Islamabad? What happens now? What are the scenarios, gentlemen?
Well, things keep changing day by day. The things, sometimes they attack Pakistan and then Pakistan sends its forces. The thing is, in terms of the balance of power, Pakistan is militarily too strong for Afghanistan to successfully force, the Northwest Frontier to secede and become part of Afghanistan. And I'm not too sure that, although they are the same tribes, they do want to be part of Afghanistan, because Afghanistan is a relatively, comparatively much less developed part of the world than
much
Pakistan.
Much poorer, much more oppressive regime.
Yeah. And I know many Afghan or these Pakhtuns who, although very nationalistic and so on, are not really very keen to be part of Afghanistan. So it depends now on, I think this will drag on and on until Pakistan and India can sort out their, border disputes. And once something is stable on the India-Pakistan border, maybe one can convince the Afghans to also sort of have a more normal relations with Pakistan, because for a long time Pakistanis were going to Kabul to watch Indian movies, and they came back with all these stories of young Afghan girls in skirts and so on, while we practiced this old type of conservative Islam. There was a period. Not very
absolutely.
long.
I mean, I have a very dear friend from a very
Yes.
eminent Pashtun family. In fact, the family of Sir Abdul Rab Nishtar, one of the founders of Pakistan, who tells me that they would go from Peshawar, especially the young boys in the family, and they would just go to look at Afghan girls in skirts.
Absolutely true.
And smoke some pot as well from time to
And
time.
Indian movies were banned in Pakistan, so you had to go to Kabul to watch them. So things were quite all right.
This is the 1970s we are talking about, in 60s, right? 60s and 70s.
When Muhammad Daud overthrew his cousin, King Zahir Shah, and he revived the Pakhtunistan issue. And at that moment, I think Zed Bhutto was in power. He then sent some people to the Americans, to the CIA, to train them for counterinsurgency. I know one of them, Colonel Imam, who later on was killed by the Taliban, who says that he was sent during Bhutto's time to the Americans to be trained into all this, to destabilize the Afghan government. Why? Because the Afghans had revived this Pakhtunistan issue. So Pakistan countered it this way, and then came, of course, a communist takeover in Afghanistan, and then all the opposition to it, conservative, fundamentalist, Islamic, shifted to Pakistan, and then the so-called Afghan Jihad took place.
Charlie Wilson's War, that movie, captures a lot.
The peak period of Afghans and Pakistan, and Pakistan, being close to one another. And there is a whole generation of Afghans who have grown up in parts of Pakistan. Karachi is now has a very large Afghan presence, actually.
Yeah, I mean,
So
look,
it's
I mean,
no,
let me just stop you and for a second and tell our viewers and listeners that for a while, Pashtun gangs and Muhajir gangs were battling for supremacy in Karachi. And this I have
yes,
heard from PPS officers, Pakistan Police Service officers.
of
So this is
course, of course.
not something just from the press, from people who were
There is a very
trying to
strong
keep control.
yeah. And when I went back to Lahore, some years ago, in the inner city, the walled city, which is so traditionally Punjabi, all the
No,
old
Sindhi,
type
right?
of
No, Lahore. Sorry, you're talking about Lahore.
yeah,
Sorry, not
in the walled
Karachi. No.
city,
Yeah.
the Afghans had bought, the businesses and turned them into shoemaking sort of small home factories and so on. And the Punjabis had moved out, and there was a feeling that the Afghans will take over Lahore. This feeling that the Afghans are always there to dominate us is deeply rooted in the Punjabi experience. From the time of Ahmad Shah Abdali, there is a saying, Khada pika pida laida baki Ahmad Shahida. That whatever you can eat and where is yours, Ahmad
Eat
Shah is
and
going to
drink.
come and going to take everything from you. So the fear of the Afghan has always been there. It's only during the time of Ranjit Singh that this threat was,
Nullified.
And then, of course, the British took over and they became the dominant power. So Punjab lived in peace because of Ranjit Singh and then 90 years of British rule.
So the Sikh Empire and the British Empire saved Punjabis
Yes,
from the
that gave
Pashtuns.
Punjab, in my DNA, I'll tell you, I'm 93.1% South Asian, which is composed of three components: Indo-Aryan, Indo-Dravidian, and Indo-Tibetan. But I'm also 7.6% Central Asian, and that means Kandahar and all. How is that possible? You see, down the ages, these people have invaded Punjab, which is the bottleneck before you, and raped the women, married the women, and left their seats. So 7.6% is their, presence in me. So you can well imagine the way we think about Afghans as a warrior people, we being people of the plains, better fed, living a more sort of
Sedentary life.
comfortable life,
Yeah.
and always feeling it reminds me of this idea of the cyclical changes when the tribes attack the cities. This is Ibn Khaldun's
Ibn
cycle
Khaldun's
of
theory. Yeah, exactly. Cycle.
So
That once you are
Punjab is typically at the receiving end from Afghan invasions.
so
So that's
Khanda Pinda
another thing to
Lahinda.
consider.
So
Yeah.
Khanda Pinda Lahinda Baki Ahmad Shada. Which
Ahmad
is like
Shahida.
what you
Ji, ji,
eat,
ji.
what you drink, what you wear is yours, and
The
everything
rest
else,
is
Ahmad Shah
It
Abdali
says
goes
all
to-
Ahmad Shah. He'll take your women as well. You know that too. Yes.
And this is the reason why Afghanistan has never been a self-supporting state. When they said, why can't the Afghan government finance itself? It never has. It used to finance itself on raids in Punjab
On
and
raid.
Sindh, right?
Yes.
And then it moved to foreign aid and British aid before that. But the idea that we
But
should take
one irony I would like to mention, King Amanullah, when he came to power, I think late 1920s or something, he wanted to modernize like Ataturk in Turkey and then in Iran and so on. But at that time, the British were not willing to entertain an independent Afghan regime. So they masterminded a coup against them and brought the mullahs again back into power. So Afghanistan has had a bad deal that way as well, through British policy.
as far as the Afghans are concerned, all trouble is caused by the British, and now that the British are gone, the legacy
It's caused by Pakistan.
Pakistan, not only to Pakistan,
Nice
but the
Pakistan.
ISI, who are in their cantonments the last representatives of the Raj in their thinking and in their policies, and also in their belief that they can control Afghanistan. The British
That's
tried it,
correct.
and Pakistan has now tried it twice, and 4 times it's failed. And
It's
all
failed.
and people have explained it's not going to work out well. But the hubris, I think it was in the water or the scotch that, Pakistani military inherited from the British, right? Because it's really strong is the belief that they can outplay the Afghans. And when the Afghans are
Imperial policy via Pakistan. Yes, things like that.
as soon as you put a government back in power, it just hasn't worked out, So it's been a failed policy, but it's one that, again, going back to this question of Pashtunistan, is that Pashtuns in Afghanistan did not want the Northwest frontier to be a part of Afghanistan, because who would be the new Pashtun elite? It would be the Pashtuns from Pakistan, better educated, wealthier. Peshawar would be the gap. What would happen to Kandahar? It would become a backwater. And similarly, you've got to remember, Pashtuns are maybe 42% of the population of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is multi-ethnic. On the frontier, it's an all Pashtun game. But if you're going to rule Afghanistan, how do you deal with Herat? How do you deal with Mazar-Sharif? And even Kabul itself is a Persian-speaking city. That work got along much better with South Asia when it was the capital of the Mughal Empire.
Yeah.
Because the Mughals knew how to rule a multi-ethnic empire, right? They didn't say, we're going to make the world great for Central Asians. They said, we're in charge. And, and we'll cut accommodations to who we're going to need. And the Mughals in particular, and most other empires, they left the Northwest frontier alone other than the passes because it wasn't worth the cost of a military occupation. So even in terms of taking the Khyber Pass, they paid off the tribes. They didn't defeat them. They said, how much do you get raiding caravans? They said, a huge amount of money. And they said, we'll pay you double. Just stop it. And that was... And then they claim control. When I first went down the Khyber Pass, there was two signs. One said, no taking pictures of tribal women. And the other said, Khyber Pass closed after dark. And I thought, yeah, it's like there's no lights. But the treaty that was actually signed, the tribe said, okay, you can take things through during the daytime, but at night we're allowed to raid. So the British signed the treaty, but they told people, don't go out at night, That's an example of that was the most powerful imperialist polity in the world. And it had to cut these kind of deals. And going back to what you're talking about with today, Pakistan is absolutely militarily superior. In 2 days, it could occupy Kabul. It could occupy Kandahar. The problem is what happens on day 3. And at this point, the Afghans know that. So they're masters of insurgency, particularly rural insurgency. And they don't even have to do it themselves because their friends, the Tehrik-e-Taliban, can do it. And they have hundreds of leftover suicide bombers. What do you do with unused suicide bombers? You direct them towards Pakistan. You say, that's the new jihad area. Although technically, how can you be fighting a jihad against another Muslim country? It's like, but that way the Taliban can say, we're not involved.
Plausible deniability. Plausible deniability.
It's not even, they are, for the most part, they're not involved because they don't need to be involved. Pakistan has enough problems of its own in Baluchistan and in the Pashtun areas that all they have to do is stir the pot. And they don't even have to finance these people. Pakistan had to finance the insurgency. This is self-generating. And that's a real problem for Pakistan because it's not a binational issue. Half of it involves internal Pakistani politics. And the question is, well, what do you do? If you move all the troops into the border, you're moving them into a hostile territory. And then what do you do when you've got there? There's a reason that armies did not occupy. Like Alexander the Great never conquered all of these areas. Why? Because he was heading straight for South Asia. He was going to leave either side alone. The problem is, if you're not careful, you can get drawn in, as the Americans were, as the Soviets were, into a war that has no conclusion, because the Afghans live there, you don't, right? So,
I mean, there's the Taliban had this phrase. A lot of officers tell me who've served many tours of duty in Afghanistan. They said, "You have the clock, we have the time."
They do, but that's an exaggeration too. The Mujahideen came to power. The Taliban came to power when the foreign occupier left and the government collapsed. There was a great battle of Kabul in which insurgents seized the city. They wait for a government to collapse, and that's a very different kind of winning. And the problem is, when you win that way, you begin to think you're king of the world because you won. And instead you entered an empty store and declared it yours. And people say, okay, now you got to run the store. And this, the Taliban were unprepared for. The first Taliban, particularly unprepared, but even this Taliban, it's a problem. Is they relied, even when they were doing their insurgency, they allowed the Republican government to continue to pay civil servants in the areas that they occupied to provide services, because they didn't have the money or the ability to provide services. So in one sense, they offloaded this service responsibility to their enemy. But now they're in charge, and all the international aid is gone. And the greatest danger to the Taliban government in Afghanistan now is the fact there is no aid coming in. And it's not only Pakistan, it's Iran that sends millions of people back. So, and with the war in Iran right now, that's cutting off sort of transit trade. Afghanistan is in an extremely difficult economic problem. Whether that's enough to cause any change, that's not something either Pakistan or Iran can produce. But in Afghanistan, things always happen unexpectedly. So
you've said that many times.
But what you never know is that even if there's a new government there, I don't think that it would change the position on the Durand line. That's like, and that's a problem for Pakistan. If Pakistan had negotiated, it's been treated as an international border, and to some extent, it's been useful for the Afghans to have a border, even if they don't recognize it, because they conduct a huge amount of smuggling trade. When I was there in the 70s, you'd see all these color TVs coming into Afghanistan, and then they said, well, they don't have any TV stations in Afghanistan. Why are they importing all these Sony TVs? They said, as soon as it crosses into Afghanistan, we unload the trucks, put it on donkeys, and we take it into Pakistan. Is that so many foreign goods were coming that way because the importers could get them tax-free into Afghanistan, smuggle them on the other side, and avoid huge tax. That was a big revenue raiser for Afghanistan. And it's like a dam on a river. If you don't block the river, you don't get the power. That border is actually useful for the Afghans. They may not recognize it, but they've never attempted to overturn it in a way. So in some ways, if Pakistan would be willing to accept it as a de facto border, you'd probably have much more success. Leave the Afghans to claim it's always been an illegitimate border, but which world borders are legitimate in the sense of the people who live there? I mean, look at Mexico and the United States, or United States and Canada. All borders are artificial. We could cut a deal with the Afghans, but don't make them give up the principle that they were cheated from the territory by the British. They were also cheated by territory in Central Asia and others. They never make they'd accept.
I have a question for Thomas. I've heard somewhere that it is the Afghan ruler who approached the British for this treaty, the Durand Line Agreement. Is this true? There is the Afghan ruler who wanted the British that the two powers should agree to this Durand Line sort of thing.
I don't think he invited them, but he was paid like 3 million rupees to accept it. So it was in his financial interest
to do that. I see.
That because he didn't have control of the territory anyway.
Okay.
So, but the other thing we can see is when Afghanistan got the Wakhan corridor, that little piece dividing now China, Tajikistan, Pakistan, it all comes together in the palm years. When the British and the Russians came up with that agreement, they said this will be Afghanistan. The emir said, I won't take it. It's never been part of Afghanistan. And he made him pay to take the land. Now it's been considered like sacred territory of Afghanistan. But the thing is that Afghan emirs were not nationalist leaders. They were dynastic leaders. So what is in the interest of my dynasty? We're never going to get back the territory that we lost to Britain after the Second Anglo-Afghan War, but it was his predecessor that had signed away Peshawar, Pashin, and all these other places. So he could blame that on that. But the British said, well, we want a line that actually runs from the Pamirs down to Baluchistan. And he was willing to give them that. And it was never really demarcated. It was put on a map, but it was never really surveyed. And they paid him a fortune to accept that. But it was the type of thing that, he benefited from. And going back to Amanullah, who got independence post-World War I in 1919, the British revenge on that is, we're not going to pay you anymore for these subsidies. And so his whole modernization project had to be financed with internal Afghan resources. And that's what really killed him. And even when revolt came, he had weapons in Peshawar and Lahore that he had bought, he had paid for, and the British refused to ship them. Which, whether the British actually organized that, they were in no great hurry to help his government survive. And after the anarchy got too great, Nader Shah was Nader Khan at that time. The troops that he raised to capture Kabul to create a new regime, they were all recruited on the British side of the border. They were all Pashtuns, but they were on the British side of the border. So the British allowed him to raise troops. They took Kabul, got rid of the mullahs, and we got dynastic kings back. But that's an example of the really complex relationship going back and forth, which neither side likes to admit that they are responsible for things or they're dependent upon anybody. And the stories that people tell, if you consider them true and as the basis for policy, you're going to run into trouble. There's a huge amount of opportunism that's, as opposed to principle, that's involved. And the Taliban can also look at this, that they can say that we burnish our domestic reputation by opposing Pakistan, as opposed to being there. Unlike India has much more money than Pakistan does. What is the advantage? Afghan governments always look, who can pay for our support? And the difficulty, Pakistan supports insurgencies because they're cheap. It cannot support a government in power. It doesn't have the money to do that. And the problem is, from Pakistan's point of view, India has the money and is willing to kind of look the other way as long as it furthers its own interests in terms of it doesn't recognize the Taliban government, but it operates inside Taliban-controlled Afghanistan. Only the Russians right now have recognized it.
So interestingly, there are two things I delineate, I conclude from what you've just said. Every Afghan ruler, either through raids or through bribery or through foreign aid, gets resources from outside to run the state. That's one.
Yes.
And number two is that in the absence of that aid, no Afghan government is really sustainable.
In the long term.
In the long term, and it falls.
That's the danger for the Taliban right now.
Got it.
In some ways, they took power too fast. I think their leadership actually did not want the government to collapse. It wanted to have an agreement so that it controlled the government, but that foreign aid would continue. And up until the Trump administration, the Americans are still providing about $2 billion in sort of humanitarian aid. Trump just got rid of that, not because he had an opinion on Afghanistan, he just got rid of everything. But that's put a difficulty there. The EU won't give money because of Afghanistan's women's policies. And there are people in the Taliban in Afghanistan that would say, we should get rid of those policies because we need this aid. But the leaders in Kandahar, no, they're true believers. We can go it alone. But as I say, this goes way, way back because the governments fear having to tax their own people in Afghanistan in order to raise revenue. First of all, because there's not much revenue there. If you looked around, you went down to South Asia, why did they go there? That's where the money was.
For centuries.
Yeah.
It was a political power whose central territories were poor and whose outer provinces were weak, were rich. And so Kabul and Kandahar, these were not, or Ghazni, if you go back to the Ghaznavids, were not particularly prosperous places. But they could go down to the plains, they could get it. They could go into Central Asia, with Iran. But they could raise troops in Afghanistan because they could promise them, we get money, you get money. And they would play on that, that idea of a warrior mentality you raise troops, but you don't have to pay them. Right? It's minimal kinds of government. A difficulty that's come up in the modern age is governments are now expected to provide services. In dynastic Afghanistan, governments were expected to preserve order, nothing more. One of the things that's happened over the past 40 years is that Afghans, they've been to Pakistan, they've been to Iran, say governments provide health services, they provide education, and they make sure people don't starve. That's a much higher bar than existed, I would say, in earlier periods of Afghanistan. And it's a standard the Taliban have to meet, maybe at a much lower standard than elsewhere, but people expect those kind of services that they didn't in the past.
But don't you think that can be worked out if they normalize relations with Pakistan, while an ambiguity on the Durand line can persist for a long time to come? Why don't they work in that direction? Why this confrontation with Pakistan?
I think it's because Pakistan puts out the maximalist demands of wanting recognition for this.
Okay, well, this Durand line, yeah.
Yeah, if Pakistan were willing to accept the ambiguity that it's an international border for all practical purposes, but we're not going to be worrying about who's crossing every day or this or that, or who's right or who's wrong. It could work, but I think particularly when governments come into power in Kabul that Pakistan has supported, they go for that maximalist demand, is that we want formal recognition. Now, whether that comes out of the history of partition and formal, I don't know, but
there's a certain irony in this, because while Pakistan is so insistent that its border with Afghanistan be demarcated legally and fixed, it is reluctant to do the same with India on Kashmir, the line of control becoming the international border and settling this. I think the Indians have been ready for it for a long time, but not anymore with Narendra Modi and the Hindu nationalist movement now in power. But Pakistan's policies have been, I think, myopic, not seeing the advantage in applying the same principle on both sides.
And you could say we are doing that on both sides, is that, look at the borders in Africa. They were all drawn by Europeans. They're totally artificial.
That's right.
They shouldn't exist. But the one thing all those countries agreed upon, if we start messing with one border,
That's
all
it.
into existence. And if Pakistan, I can see at the beginning, particularly over Kashmir, certain things with Afghanistan, but after all this time, agreeing to disagree, is that the line of demarcation is both sides accept that as a border. The US and China did that with Taiwan, is that, yes, Taiwan is part of China, but the US, but it's not part of China. The longer that goes on, and the more you do not have to, that it doesn't provoke insurgencies, doesn't provoke terrorism, the more you get back to normal, the more stability can occur in those regions. And I think at that point, yeah, Pakistan has a lot to offer Afghanistan in terms of economics, education. It's the natural partner to Afghanistan in a lot of ways.
That's right. That's right.
It squandered that in essence of wanting maximal demands as opposed to kind of, we'll work with this, and over time, to some extent, this is how the EU has come into existence. It accepts the borders of all these sovereign states, but over time, EU regulations have brought them together. It's never challenged the borders of these states or their sovereignty, but over time, it's forced, beginning with France and Germany. And if you could do it with France and Germany, I've got to think it's possible in other parts.
It works. It works. Yeah, of course.
So, but going back to a key thing, a very key thing. Pakistan has a maximalist position, number one. Number two, Pakistan has sent back 2 million Afghans back to Afghanistan. So these are going to, these are bitter seeds, and Pakistan will reap a grim harvest because, as you said, a lot of suicide bombers can just carry out their activities across the border. So does this mean that Pakistan now deals with protracted insurgencies? And regardless of whether the Taliban government falls tomorrow, day after, or the day after, the tensions persist in this entire swathe of territory along the border.
That's existed in Baluchistan, for example, which is not directly related to this. It's a long-run insurgency. But yes, it's the type of thing that the Taliban are also being intransigent right now because the mullahs in Kandahar are setting the policies in a way. But when it comes to economic integration and other things, Afghanistan's major weapon against Pakistan is the fact that it pushes at cleavages that already exist in Afghanistan, in Pakistan. The Afghans used to say if the country was going to fall apart, it would have already fallen apart because we haven't had governments. So, they'd say Afghanistan can be a nation without an army or government. They look at Pakistan and said that's an army with a nation. And, and if that control goes, you could easily get 4 new nations. And when I sometimes talk to Pakistanis about that, they say, oh, no, that's not possible. And they say, well, what about Bangladesh? And the interesting, Bangladesh has left the consciousness of Pakistan. It's like it never existed. That when you say, well, you lost half your people, to some extent, those were never our people. It's just gone. But the degree of desire to be separate, particularly in Baluchistan and Northwest Frontier, is so strong that a government, rather than attempting to integrate these people, has pushed into that if the center can't hold, you've already got, and the problem on that is the Afghans would probably get behind a Pashtunistan movement. To some extent.
Sorry, say it again.
They would get behind it because it would actually give them an opportunity to push the Tariqa Taliban out of Afghanistan, as well as send back maybe a lot of the people that were born in Pakistan that are technically Afghan, but it would take a burden off of them. But in Pakistan during the insurgency against Afghanistan, Pakistan was supporting an insurgency waiting for a time when it could succeed. And if Pakistan had refused to do that, it's not clear the insurgency would have succeeded. In Pakistan, these are really long-running disputes, and of which Afghanistan has never facilitates, but is not sponsoring. Really, this is to its large extent an internal Pakistani problem, really.
Pakistan has a problem with the Pakistani Kashmir now. There's a great deal of alienation from Pakistan, and so Pakistan has not been able to manage the fact of Pakistan being a plural nation. This emphasis on just being Muslims is just delusionary, I think. And you have to accommodate the linguistic and other considerations of a federation.
The linguistic,
that's the problem of Pakistan.
ethnic, Even
ethnic as well. Yeah.
even the differences in religion, because Shias increasingly have a tough time in Pakistan, despite the fact that Muhammad Ali Jinnah was a Shia, and the Ahmadis have been treated
Yeah,
horribly, and so on
that
and so
story
forth.
we know very
Yeah,
well. Yes,
exactly.
that's true.
So
Although the Shia factor, I think, is in a way is exaggerated.
I see.
They are only 5 to 10% of the population. They exaggerate their numbers, and the Pakistani government deflates their numbers.
Understood.
They can't be more than 10%, I think.
Got it.
No chance.
But the regions are restive. That's the key point.
Yeah,
The
Gilgit,
Balochis,
Baltistan. Yeah, that area.
the Balochis,
yes.
there is the Tehrik-e
Not in
Taliban.
Balochistan. Not in Balochistan. Just in Gilgit, Baltistan, they constitute a very small majority.
I moved on from the Shia element. I moved on. I said the regions are restive.
The Baloch factor.
The regions are restive. So different regions have their, million mutinies now.
That's correct.
I mean, these regions are really quite old. If you go back even to the ancient Persian empires, provinces of the empires are the same places we're talking about. They still have the same centers: Kandahar, Kabul, Herat, Balkh, Peshawar. These are really, really old, right? And it's because they're natural economic units as well. The thing about national states, it begins to disguise that because it wants to make things uniform. The thing about the British Raj or the Mughal Empire is they always recognized these were kind of natural units, and they, that Rajputs, that's where they lived. We're going to have to deal with them. Similarly with the Pashtuns is, they live there, but we deal with them in a different way, because they can be dealt with in a different way. And the problem with the national state is they want all laws to apply to all people equally. And that takes away a lot of your flexibility, and
right.
And also, if you're running a central government, you consider any challenge to be a challenge to your sovereignty. Whereas with these empires and stuff, like rebellions were baked in. They knew how to deal with them. It's like some places cause trouble, we deal with that. We can either have a punitive campaign, or we can buy them off, or we'll do something. But they rarely became insurgencies. They were one-off kinds of things because their government style was much more flexible, and they would find clients that would rule on their behalf, and there was a lot of flexibility. And one of the problems with modern states is I think they take European models in a way that I'm not all that sure they work that well in Europe, but they certainly don't work well in South and Central Asia. In terms of these kind of things. But it's very difficult for a government that considers itself modern to go back and rethink. Even the United States, which is one of the oldest federal republics in the world, whenever it went abroad, never introduced federalists. It loves centralized states.
Yeah, that's true.
And we have the longest experience with federal government and dealing with people that are quite unlike one another, but they're all part of a sovereign state. And the United States, as foreign policy, never took that as a model to say, if we can have Mississippi and Massachusetts in the same country, why do we assume in Afghanistan that it should be uniform? All right, so we don't care what they do in Mississippi as long as they don't bother us, And similarly, the problem in Pakistan or Afghanistan is the government says, we want everybody to do the same thing. And they appoint their governors, who are almost always outsiders, to come in and alienate the population. What empires work with is, let's rule somebody who's known to the locals, who's sympathetic to their needs, but is also loyal to us. The Chinese model is you send in a stranger who will be absolutely neutral. But they were ruling over an entirely different kind of place. And again, I think a lot of the lessons of the past are lost in terms of there's a lot of solutions that are out there, but modern governments have a hard time recognizing them. It doesn't.
All right. On that note, so we can expect there to be more volatility, more uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, what people in the Pentagon like calling the VUCA world. So the VUCA world will persist between Afghanistan and Pakistan, and we can expect tensions to persist regardless of which government is in charge, and we can expect insurgency to persist. And unless there is a change in the thinking in Islamabad, which adopts a federation, which adopts more flexibility, especially towards the regions, violence will continue. Would that be fair summary, gentlemen?
Yes, there is the need for substantive decentralization of power.
And the other thing is, you do better by linking people up economically and letting the politics come later. Make them dependent upon each other economically. They'll be more willing to make political compromises later.
The EU model,
Absolutely.
the European Union model.
And by Pakistan cutting off trade with Afghanistan, by doing other kinds, it's doing just the opposite.
It's the opposite. I agree.
Economically, in a sense, and say, so as friends, we should take care of it. The EU did a wonderful job on that, and 500 years of European conflict. That's not an easy thing to overcome. So it's not a perfect solution, but it's one that would benefit Pakistan because Pakistan needs an export market. It produces a lot of things. Afghanistan is a natural market. And again, these political things now stand in the way of that as an obstacle.
Gentlemen, thank you both for your valuable time. We'll have you both back very soon. Those of you who've liked this video, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, press the bell icon, you'll get notifications, and go to our website, sign up for our newsletter. Thank you for watching FO Live. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.